Preface. The primary purpose of this work is to briefly review the psychological, philosophical, neuroscientific and methodological frameworks that have been developed throughout the history of the West, Europe, Americas and Middle East, and East, China and India, in order to promote self-inquiry and self-regulation. The primary emphasis of this work is upon theories developed by the West. At the very beginning, we will go through some of the modern philosophical thoughts, which includes Plato. Once a brief review of these Western thinkers has been completed, we will explore a brief history of the philosophies of the East, yoga, Buddhist philosophy of mind, the naturalists, and traditional Chinese medicine. Next, we will review modern applied neuroscience and biofeedback for self-regulation, which incorporates modern research on the biological and psychological impact of sustained executive attention. Next, we will explore Piaget's model of psychological development and a theorized post-formal operational stage of development, which will be integrated into Ken Wilber's integral framework. Finally, the practical applications of these theories will provide the reader with an overview of strategic interventions which may promote self-inquiry and self-regulation. The reader should also note that some of the concepts presented in this work represent a variety of theories and hypotheses that have not yet been subjected to experimentation. Therefore, when encountering sections that refer to known research and hypotheses that may be the case, I encourage the reader to approach the proposed theory with a critical mind. What follows must be regarded as a combination of historical review, contemporary research, and new theories about the nature of the brain and mind. Melissa Lavery holds an MS in psychology with an emphasis in child and adolescent development, and she will describe the Myers-Briggs personality typology. Mrs. Lavery is also responsible for a significant amount of proofing and editing which has assisted with refining the work that follows. R.Y. Langham holds a PhD in psychology, and she will provide a brief review of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, in order to describe the dysregulated physiological and psychological system. The Myers-Briggs and DSM represent models of human personality, perception, and behavior that have not yet been subjected to rigorous experimental testing. Rather, they are naturally biased in favor of subjective interpretations of a variety of traits and behaviors. Therefore, these sections must be regarded as a tentative way of describing personality and behavior. To those contemporary publishers, researchers and authors who have been referenced throughout the work that follows, this work has been cross-referenced with published content through iAuthenticate, a system used by journals such as Elsevier, Nature, the National Science Foundation and others in order to verify that all content is attributed to sources accurately. This platform is designed to compare the content of this work with approximately 44 million journal articles, 98 million online and offline content resources, and over 56 billion total indexed pages on the Internet. However, there is always the possibility that a work has been inaccurately represented or referenced. Introduction. Philosophy has constituted the root of systematic inquiry upon which all interior and exterior forms of knowledge have been developed throughout the West. Russell, 1972. Therefore, a review of philosophy may serve as a means by which to prepare for a study of the mind and body via 20th and 21st century psychological and physiological frameworks. Philosophy's two principal methods of acquiring knowledge have included a priori and a posteriori inquiry. A priori reasoning has consisted in the knowledge of reality, which has been ascertained primarily through interior, logical analysis of a thing without direct experience of that thing, i.e. mathematics, tautological statements, i.e. all women are not men, and deduction from pure reason, which does not require external observation. A posteriori reasoning has consisted in knowledge that is acquired through empirical observation of objects in one's environment, i.e., performing experiments on the mechanics of physical objects or observing the brain activity of a mammal. The process of addressing a priori realities and a posteriori realities has served as a means by which philosophers and psychologists have engaged with two primary faculties of human perception and established some of the most influential fields for studying the nature of mind and reality. Socrates. Socrates was most well known for his development of the Socratic Method, which made use of a dialogical interrogatory designed to cause an individual to deeply explore the veracity of his or her stated thesis, 400s BCE. Socrates traditionally applied this method to abstract concepts such as morality and virtue, where an individual's beliefs may or may not have been founded upon logically consistent arguments. Although the mind was capable of conceiving of logical concepts, each concept may have been shown to hold some degree of logical inconsistency. This could result in an evolving dialogue that would develop the capacity for the speaker to abandon his or her most sacred tenets during the process of discovering the truth. The Socratic method was persistent in challenging theories so that one could recognize logical inconsistencies, integrate the new data, and formulate a new and more logical premise from which to proceed. However, the ultimate result of this process frequently involved the acknowledgement of one's state of unknowingness about a particular thing. That is, rather than an increasingly studied theory, one would repeatedly discover the paradoxes inherent in conceiving of truth. This would, in turn, stimulate further creative inquiry and synthesis that could produce ever higher order systems of logic. The question of whether such a process ultimately ended in a stable theorem that was logically consistent may not yet have an answer. One may argue that a definitive theory of the nature of reality is possible, and one may also argue that the process of open inquiry is continuous. The Socratic method may simply serve to continuously increase the capacity for interpreting the nature of the universe through ever-increasing levels of complexity. Meanwhile, each level of increasingly sophisticated theorem may be subject to the Socratic method once more. The following example may illustrate the manner in which a Socratic dialogue may have unfolded. Philosophy and Science of the Arab World. Platonic thought heavily influenced philosophy throughout the Arab world, but the unique scientific developments achieved by this culture included significant contributions to the fields of astronomy, physics, and mathematics. During the European Middle Ages, medieval or Dark Ages, the Arab world underwent a golden age, which stretched from Spain to Pakistan and included the development of the first-degree granting universities, formal training and licensing of physicians, and the flourishing of art and architecture. Alhazen has been regarded as one of the first true modern scientists and one of the first to rigorously develop a systematic approach to a posteriori research via the scientific method, 200 years prior to its prominent adoption by Europeans. Alhazen focused principally upon studying the physical world, wherein he became known for contributing to the field of astronomy, mathematics, geometry, optics, refraction, and mechanics. Meanwhile, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi was another thinker who was principally responsible for developing the foundations for the field of algebra and trigonometry. Meanwhile, in Europe, a dark age of philosophy and science was underway. Chapter 1. Modern Psychology. Sigmund Freud. Dr. Sigmund Freud, 19th to 20th century, has been regarded as the founder of the modern field of psychology, where he was responsible for developing the theory that humans display unconscious as well as conscious qualities of their psyches. Freud's theories have been described through the iceberg model, where consciousness and the ego rested on top of the water, and the unconscious aspects of the human mind rested beneath the water, where the majority of the ice in the iceberg was held. For Freud, there were three aspects of consciousness, which consisted in the ID, ego, and the superego. The ID was the first structure of consciousness to develop in an infant's mind, and this was the impulsive aspect of consciousness that simply sought pleasure and avoided pain. The ID would not differentiate between good and bad, right or wrong. It would simply want what it wanted when it wanted. The next structure to develop, according to Freud, was the superego. The superego was that aspect of consciousness that was socially conditioned through interjection and served as the unconscious system of beliefs that repress the unacceptable impulsive thoughts and behaviors of the ID. The third structure to develop was the ego, which would enable the individual to balance the conflicting demands of the ID and the superego. The theories that would follow were controversial. Freud's theories were developed during a time when people used long tablecloths in order to cover their table legs, which were considered to be too sexually suggestive. Freud lived in a social world in which human beings were not allowed to talk about sex, so he began to develop the theory that sexual repression was the fundamental cause for all human neuroses. The Oedipus and Electra complexes. The repression of sexual energy, which he referred to as libido, and the ID's impulses resulted in psychological and physiological tension that would need to be released. The ID's urges could be released through sublimation, where sexual energy could be expressed directly or diverted, redirected, and channeled into constructive and creative activities. Freud believed that the process of sublimation may have resulted in the development of civilization, art, morals, science, and other domains of human productivity. For Freud, the key to psychoanalysis was to recognize that sexual repression may have been damaging in certain circumstances. For example, Freud proposed that once a child was born, he or she could develop a reflexive and primitive desire to mate. The first people with whom an infant made contact were the parents, so this sexual energy may have been directed toward the parents as a matter of reflex. For a male, the first possible object of sexual attraction was the mother, which would result in the Oedipus complex. This complex was characterized by the boy's unconscious competition with the father and the emergence of a primitive and biological impulse to dominate and kill his opponent in order to mate with the mother. Once this desire to kill his father emerged, this instinct would cause the child to consciously or unconsciously believe that he was in a real conflict over the mother. However, this would be a conflict that the child could never win because the father was physically superior. As a result of the father's physical superiority, the child would next develop castration anxiety. Carl Jung would later refer to the opposite reaction of girls' attraction to their fathers as the Electra complex. Freud believed that these biological impulses would create a lasting conflict within the psyche of a child because the ego would not be able to reconcile the demands of the ID and superego's need for conformity with social norms, i.e., do not express these sexual and aggressive urges within the family system. This ongoing tension, if unresolved, would result in neurosis and eventually a split in the mind. Provided that such a split was severe and protracted, the neurosis could progress into psychosis, where an individual would completely regress into an infantile state of confusion, emotional reactivity, and a complete loss of self-control. Psychosis represented the dominance of the ID within one's psyche. Psychosexual stages of development. Freud also theorized that children progressed through a variety of psychosexual stages of development as they matured. Children were not born complete, they evolved over time. The psychosexual development of a human consisted of the following stages, in order: the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. If one did not reconcile the respective urges of the ID with the expected behavioral norms of the superego at each stage of development, he or she would fail to fully develop into the subsequent stage. These unresolved conflicts would later lead to fixations at a particular stage of development until they were able to achieve emotional catharsis and resolve their intraphysic conflicts. The oral stage of development. The oral stage of development described a child's initial capacity for erogenous stimulation. The mouth was the first erogenous zone to come online for an infant, and his or her exploration of the environment would involve touching objects to the mouth. This stimulation would also occur while feeding from the mother's nipple, and for the infant this was an enjoyable and sensually stimulating experience. Moreover, breastfeeding served as an experience of bonding and connection with the mother, so this erogenous pleasure would lead to a conflict between the sexually impulsive ID and the socially conditioned superego once self-awareness emerged into consciousness. The anal stage of development. The anal stage of development generally occurred when children underwent potty training. This was the period of time when children learned how to control their bowel movements. The ways in which the parents interacted with their children during this time would shape the way in which they developed their personality structure and character throughout the rest of their lives. If their parents were excessively firm, abusive and tight with the child each time they failed to hold a bowel movement, this would result in an anal retentive neurosis later in life. If they were truly anal retentive as adults, for Freud, these individuals would tend to be controlling, uptight, and generally rigid. The individual would need to reconcile the trauma that occurred during the anal stage of development through psychoanalysis. The phallic stage of development. At the phallic stage of development, children would discover that stimulating their genitals felt good, and they would begin exploring the sensations associated with their genitals, both privately and publicly. Therefore, this would be a time when children received messages that stimulating their genitals and exposing them in public was not appropriate. For some, this repression would continue after the anal stage of development and into the phallic stage. Children would then begin unconsciously accepting introjects or socially conditioned beliefs into their belief systems, which would inform them that it was unacceptable for them to experience sexual pleasure and sexual gratification, privately or publicly. For Freud, inadequately reconciling the tension between their sexual desires and social expectations during this stage of development would result in a sexual neurosis, such as impotence or sexual identity confusion in later life. The latency stage of development represented the stage in pre-adolescence when the libido went underground and prepared for a powerful re-emergence through adolescent sexuality. During the subsequent period of adolescent sexuality, the ID would be supercharged by hormones that were released by the brain and into the body, causing a massive uprising of libidinal energy. When the libido was fully reactivated, the superego would react according to its design and attempt to repress those sexual urges. The genital stage of development. At the genital stage of development, one would begin to regulate one's sexual urges and experience a form of healthy sexual expression. During this stage of development, the ego would be capable of reconciling the competing demands of the ID and the superego in a responsible and mature fashion. Sublimination would become a powerful tool for channeling the libido into creative activities that could contribute to society as a whole. Meanwhile, this was also the period of time in which a mate was selected. Therefore, libido would be expressed sexually within a healthy and socially accepted context. During Freud's time, this expression occurred during marriage. Psychoanalysis. Freud believed that it was important for people to develop cognitive insight into the operations of their own minds, to develop knowledge of how their childhood experiences may have contributed to their present-day problems. In Freud's view, developing insight was the first step to resolving intrapsychic conflict. The second step was developing the capacity for catharsis. Catharsis was, for Freud, the time when an individual experienced an upwelling of feelings, thoughts, memories and experiences that he or she had repressed, denied and relegated to the realm of the unconscious. Free association. During the process of psychoanalysis, Freud would ask his clients to enter a private treatment room, take a seat on a couch, and face away from him and his other analysts. The purpose of facing away from the analyst was to ensure that the physician maintained a sense of scientific, rational, and medical objectivity which would enable the analyst to diagnose and treat the patient. Next, the patient would be encouraged to begin free association. Free association was the process by which the patient was instructed to allow all the content of his or her consciousness to emerge unimpeded through verbal expression. The patient was encouraged to talk about whatever came to mind, regardless of whether it made sense or appeared to be connected to his or her problems. The key to free association for Freud was that free association would allow the superego to relax its control over the ID and permit repressed impulses and memories to flow into conscious awareness. This process was exemplified through the Freudian slip, which was the expression of an unconscious desire. During free association, one could begin discussing memories of smoking tobacco, wherein they could mistakenly say the word penis rather than cigar. According to Freud, if an individual made a slip, the analyst would pause, interrupt, and provide the individual with an interpretation of their word choice. If a male said penis while talking about his mother and father's trip to a tobacco shop, this would serve as an indication that the Oedipus complex was present. Freud would then describe to the patient the ways in which he believed his unique family history was shaped by the Oedipus complex, and he would assist the client with experiencing insight into this problem. Catharsis. Freud acknowledged that insight alone was not enough, and catharsis was required for full psychological integration to occur. Catharsis was the process by which an individual suddenly experienced an upwelling of tears, anger, sadness, or whatever experience was locked in the unconscious and denied for years. The key to the cathartic event was to directly re-experience the incident that was previously denied an opportunity to emerge into awareness. Next, one would need to re-experience the impulse and feelings of shame during a time when no shame would be inserted into the individual's mind, i.e. a safe place to re-experience the event, such as the analyst's office. Stage progression and fixation behavior. For Freud, his patients would progress through a variety of stages of development during psychoanalysis, which was directly correlated with their childhood stages of oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital development. For example, Freud showed interest if an individual was obsessed with thoughts or behaviors connected with the mouth. If a patient came into his office with an overeating problem, Freud would likely suggest that this individual was locked at an oral stage of development. Here, the individual was not able to fully complete all the processes necessary to achieve the full gratification of oral needs during infancy. For example, if the individual was never breastfeeded and only given a bottle, he or she could develop an oral fixation. To Freud, it would be reasonable for the individual to develop an eating disorder whereby he or she would constantly seek to stimulate the mouth in some way. Thereafter, patients would need to develop a rational insight-based understanding of what was going on in their minds and directly re-experience the pain and trauma of their early childhood experiences in a safe environment in order to achieve catharsis. Transference. Transference represented a critical stage during the psychoanalytic process, wherein the individual re-experienced the content of a previous childhood relationship with the analyst. For example, transference could occur when a patient suddenly felt that the analyst was just like his or her mother or father, which could cause the patient to develop a murderous rage that was directed toward the analyst. This would be regarded as a highly sensitive stage of psychoanalysis, wherein the analyst would need to remain objective, impartial, and uninvolved with the emotional life of the patient in order to ensure that counter-transference did not occur. For Freud, counter-transference would be a risk to the patient and analyst, whereby the analyst could begin reciprocating similar feelings and believe that the patient was just like his or her son or daughter. This example of counter-transference, according to Freud, would interfere with the psychoanalytic process. However, Freud considered it a positive development for the patient to experience transference because it provided the analyst more material with which to work. Defense mechanism. Another significant contribution of Freud's was his recognition that human beings developed defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms consisted in those strategies that people used in order to prevent themselves from experiencing painful unconscious material. For example, the defense mechanism of intellectualization would occur when an individual understood, cognitively, what appeared to have occurred during childhood to cause his or her pain. The individual could spend hours, days, weeks, and months cognitively recapitulating memories of what occurred when he or she was younger. Although the individual may have had a legitimate desire to cognitively understand the subject, the patient would not re-experience the emotions connected with the memory. Catharsis could not occur if an individual was over-intellectualizing and living in the realm of conceptual thought. Another defense mechanism that Freud described was displacement. Displacement could have been exemplified by a patient who accidentally slammed his or her hand into a car door on the way to the office. Next, the patient would walk into the office and could express anger with the analyst for not making sufficient therapeutic progress. Here, the patient's anger was caused by the car door injury, but the feeling was misdirected to an unrelated object, the analyst. Denial was another defense mechanism that Freud described, whereby an individual could reject the interpretations of the analyst. Denial may become tricky because, in some cases, the analyst could be wrong and the patient could reject the analyst's interpretation on legitimate grounds. However, in the case where the analyst was correct, this behavior was regarded as a defense mechanism. Chapter 2. Psychology of Eastern Philosophies. During the roughly 2,500 plus years in which the West was developing its philosophy of mind, morals, science and civilization, the Far East also continued to refine its approach to life's most fundamental questions. The schools of yoga and Buddhism dominated much of India, while the naturalists, Taoism and Confucianism dominated China. Although interactions with the West have occurred throughout antiquity, the yogic school of Buddhism's most recent relationship with the West has been documented through philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer's work during the 19th century. Yoga and Buddhism began to more significantly influence Western philosophy and psychology during the late 20th century as neuroscience began to study yogic and Buddhist techniques for modulating activity within the central nervous system. Yoga. The founder or founders and the date of publication of the original philosophical school of yoga are unknown, but the primary text from which the majority of their traditions is referred to as the Upanishads, 2500 to 1500 BCE. Yoga has been primarily divided into a variety of schools, which include Buddhism, Ashtanga Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Shaivism, and Jainism and Classical Yoga. The common elements that have joined these schools included the practice of training attention through meditation, developing an altruistic and compassionate attitude toward others, behaving in a moral manner, and engaging in physical exercises that reduce physical and mental stress and enhance general well-being. The fundamental objective of each school has been to achieve mental, spiritual, moral, and physical enlightenment, which generally consisted in realizing one's true nature as a non-dual being that emanated its consciousness into the world of form through the duality or the appearance of separateness. Therefore, one's essential nature was non-dual. This model is similar to Plotinus's propositions on the one, the emanation from the one into the many, and the return to the one. Through engaging with meditation, intellectual development, positive moral conduct, physical exercise, and other practices, one could develop insight into the nature of reality. Through these practices, one could also reduce one's suffering while cultivating awareness, happiness, and virtue. Traditional yogic meditation was primarily focused upon an eyes-closed, single-pointed attention, wherein the individual allowed sensory information from the exterior environment to subside. Through focusing upon an eyes-closed, single-pointed sustained attention practice, the individual could strongly enhance the sense of self-awareness, spaciousness, peace, quiescence, and relaxation. Meanwhile, the physical stretching exercises, referred to as asanas, were designed to relax muscle and connective tissues while emphasizing spinal strength, flexibility, and health for the purpose of clearing energy pathways and opening the chakras and nadis. The chakras and nadis were energy centers throughout the body that yoga purported to support the individual's consciousness within the physical body. This energy could either flow with strength and vitality or flow in a limited manner. Through stretching the body and strengthening the spine, one could prepare the nerve plexus at the root of the spine to send charged energy toward the top of the skull, where the energy of the lower spine, Kundalini, would exit through the crown of the head and return to the base of the spine, forming a circuit of energy flow referred to as the macrocosmic orbit. Meanwhile, through practicing controlled breathing exercises, one could also move energy from the base of the spine through a narrower pathway through the chakras, which was referred to as the microcosmic orbit. Through strengthening single-pointed attention, strengthening the body and spine, and producing an increase in base spine energy that flowed upward toward the brain, one could develop sufficient energy for enhanced mental clarity, compassion, and perhaps full enlightenment. The correlation between the purported energies of the Kundalini, chakras, nadis and modern Western measurements of known energies have not yet been fully refuted or supported. However, the polyvagal theory put forth by Dr. Stephen Porges could serve as a potential bridge with the yogic practices, which are strongly focused upon breathing as a means by which to regulate the central nervous system, heart rate, digestive, musculoskeletal and other body functions. This would not be to suggest as one-to-one correlation, but simply one of many potential intersections with modern psychological research. The energies that yogic practitioners have reported to exist could have indeed been legitimate physical forces that have yet to be measured with sufficiently sensitive instrumentation as with traditional Chinese medicine. The proposition that a subtle energy of the mind exists in a discrete domain that is distinct from the energies of the physical body may be evidenced as true. However, one must also consider that this represents an outdated interpretation of psychological sensations, just as outdated as the West interpretation of biles, humours, and the value of bloodletting. To date, Western empirical research has neither sufficiently refuted nor supported the claims in either case. Regardless, the health benefits of yogic practices upon the immune system, emotional regulation, vital organ health, brain performance, and subjective experience have been well established. Meanwhile, Siddhartha Gautama's school of yoga and meditation strongly influenced the philosophies of the East for the past 2500 years. Chapter 3. Human Central Nervous System. The human brain and central nervous system, CNS, have evolved primarily for the purposes of sustaining life and reproducing, but more recently, the function of the nervous system has included the support of complex conscious experience and cognitive processing. The human central nervous system consists in the brain and the spinal cord, which could be subdivided into the brain's white and grey matter, the brain's brainstem, cerebellum, the encephalon, the spinal cord and its cranial nerves, and the peripheral nervous system. The brain's white matter is comprised of axons and oligodendrocytes, and the grey matter is primarily comprised of neurons. Both white matter and grey matter contain glial cells, which perform a variety of supportive roles designed to facilitate nerve signal transmission. Nerve cells. The central nervous system is comprised of neurons, which transmit signals from one nerve cell to another through chemical messengers, which are released by the nerve cell's axons. The nerve cell's axons extend outward from nerve cells in order to transmit chemical signals to the dendrites of nearby receiving neurons in order to create a cascade of signals that propagate through extensive nerve pathways throughout the brain and body. The transmitting nerve cell must release a sufficient quantity of chemical messengers, often dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, acetylcholine, GABA, etc., into the synapse, the gap between each axon terminal and dendrite, in order for the receiving nerve cell to undergo a polarity change. Polarity change occurs when the nerve cell's ion pump, which is embedded within its cellular membrane, rapidly alters polarity and produces an electrochemical gradient. Once an electrochemical gradient is achieved, the nerve cell triggers the release of chemical messengers, which are subsequently released from its axon into yet another synapse. Through repeatedly transmitting these electrochemical signals across multiple down-chain neurons, awareness, thought, sensation and action are generated. The process by which consciousness is generated has not yet been universally agreed upon, and researchers are still investigating this question. Measuring brain activity and major brain networks. The metabolic activity of these nerve cells requires oxygen, which is transported to the brain by blood. Therefore, the level of activity in a variety of brain regions may be measured through observing real-time changes in brain blood flow through functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Through monitoring brain region blood flow, one may determine correlations between activity within various cortical networks, dense regions of related nerve cells, and subjective states of experience. The default mode network, DMN, represents a significant resting state network which may be correlated with daydreaming, inattentive states, and thinking about the past and future. Medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, medial prefrontal, and lateral parietal cortex. The DMN appears to be inversely related with the task-positive network, TPN, of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, anterior insula, inferior parietal cortex, and anterior cingulated cortex. The engagement of executive attention and focus upon exterior visual objects results in the suppression of DMN activity and enhancement of activity in the task-positive network. Consequently, low-value energy states, as described in the section entitled Practical Applications that follows, may be correlated with activation of the DMN because the prefrontal cortex is disengaged and the amygdala may be more prepared to react fearfully to interior and external stimuli, negative thoughts or memory, unexpected external events, etc. Center value and high value states may be correlated with the activation of the TPN. Here, prefrontal activation serves to orient the brain toward the internal and external environment in an alert, relaxed, attentive state, which naturally suppresses activity in the amygdala. The image renders a TPN that is active during a mental task, yellow and red, which is inversely correlated with DMN deactivation, green and blue. The activity of these networks may be voluntarily modulated through the application of a variety of unique strategies, which include biofeedback-facilitated psychological self-regulation and other methods. Morality, truth, and aesthetics. Plato's original conception of the good, the true, and the beautiful may also be correlated with the cortical networks responsible for processing these and related constructs. Dr. Mendes of Departments of Neurology and Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the David Geffen School of Medicine at the University of California has published research that suggests that morality construct processing may be measurable within the human brain. Dr. Mendes's research has suggested that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, may be correlated with the subjective processing of morality. Meanwhile, the brain's behavior may also be observed during truth-telling and deception tasks, where researchers have observed something significant. The brain activity may be correlated with reporting what one believes to be true, but the research does not suggest what is true. Simply, what one reports to be their personal perspective on the truth versus deliberately withholding that perspective on truth. The human capacity to perceive beauty has also been observed through brain imaging research, where the left prefrontal dorsolateral cortex has been associated with visual aesthetic perception. Additional research has also suggested the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is also involved with the perception of beauty. As indicated previously, the VMPFC has likewise been correlated with moral processing. Each of these functions appear to involve the prefrontal cortex, which represents the most recent evolutionary development in human brain structure.